Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. Nevada's election laws have seen sweeping changes in recent years, especially with the shift to universal vote by mail. Officials, media, and the voters have all had to adjust quickly to a rapidly evolving voting landscape. In 2025, though, state lawmakers didn't make any sweeping changes to voting laws. Like so many other issues, major changes were hard to come by, with divided government and no extra money to spend. Still, a handful of smaller but important changes did make it through the legislature, including new protections and safeguards, and one fix directly responding to widespread confusion from the 2024 election. A lot of these measures flew under the radar during the session, so this week we're taking a closer look at how 2026 and future elections will be different in Nevada. My guest is Kerry Durmick, the Nevada State Director of All Voting is Local. That's a nonpartisan voting rights advocacy group which pushed for many of these changes. We had a great conversation about what changed, what didn't, and the controversial proposal that will be on your ballot in 2026. Friend of the show, a two-time guest, I think it is, Kerry Durmick joining me now. Kerry, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem, Ben. Thanks so much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you are the Nevada State Director of All Voting is Local, and it was in that role that you participated in the very first ever, and hopefully not the last, Battleground Nevada debate on question 3 last year, which hopefully listeners got to check out. So cool piece of Battleground Nevada history, and we're having you back. How's your summer been? What have you been up to?
My summer has been great. I was off for 2 weeks in July, which was very nice.
Yeah.
And I had I went to college in the South, so I had friends from the South come and visit me. And then I went and saw my parents. My parents actually live in Texas, so I went and saw my parents for a week. And then I just had a little staycation for the rest of it. It's been great. Yeah, just
Very
being
good.
a visitor in my own city, which is now Vegas. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, everyone involved in the Nevada politics sphere kind of needs July or at least June after the legislative session, which is kind of what we're talking about today. So glad you got some R&R after a crazy 2025 legislature. Before we get into kind of the changes maybe to Nevada's voting laws that we're going to see in upcoming elections that came out of the 2025 legislature, let's zoom out a little bit and just kind of look at the overall landscape when it comes to ballot access here in the Silver State. Overall, do Nevadans have good access to the ballot box as compared to other states around the country?
Yeah, I would say that here in Nevada, we have some of the best ballot access across the country. Even though other states are attempting to roll back access to the ballot, Nevada keeps marching forward. So we have programs like we have universal vote by mail. We also have 2 weeks of early voting in Clark and Washoe counties, and the rurals have 2 weeks of early voting as well too at their polling places. So you can also vote in person as well too on election day during early voting. And we also have things like same day voter registration as well too. And then this last session, we saw actually more access be increased for our elections that are coming up in 2026.
Yeah, there were a handful of bills. As you said, the access is already pretty strong. So I wouldn't say major reforms necessarily, but tinkering around the edges to kind of make things more accessible for Nevadans. And obviously these bills were able to get through with the Republican governor and the democratically controlled legislature. We'll talk about a handful of them, but what's maybe one big change that really voters will notice in 2026 when they go to the ballot box? What's the most consequential change that came out of this past session?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest changes that people are going to see like that will directly impact them is I know in, Washoe and Clark, not in every single rural county, but a lot of people were getting their vote by mail ballot before their sample ballot. And then in actually a bipartisan effort between Assemblymember Hafen and Speaker Yeager, they actually put together a bill that will actually require election officials to send your sample ballot before your mail ballot. So no matter what zip code or what county or what city you live in within the state, you're going to get that sample ballot first before you get your mail ballot. And I think this is really, really important so people have that extra time to actually go through that sample ballot. Whether you're going to vote by mail or vote in person, it doesn't matter. Just you want to be able to go through that sample ballot with your friends and your family or yourself to make sure that you're voting the way that you want to vote. So I think that's probably the most direct impact change we're going to see to voters in this upcoming 2026 elections.
Yeah, I think I'm going to restate that one too, because it is
Yeah.
critically important. I mean, in upcoming elections, you will get your sample ballot before the real ballot, because I remember fielding calls. We were getting emails here at this station. What's going on? I haven't gotten my sample ballot. And while there was nothing nefarious about that, and it was completely legal to send it in within the timelines that they did, it just people for many years prior to switching to universal mail-in voting were used to getting their sample ballot before, because we didn't really get mail ballots. So just kind of this new wrinkle that kind of showed up in the process. Again, not illegal or nefarious by any means, but just contributed to a little bit of confusion. So that's a big one. How did that kind of come to be from your perspective? You guys are obviously lobbying down there in Carson City quite a bit. Is that something that just kind of arose out of that confusion and leaders just kind of for both parties said, okay, we need a fix to this?
I think just like what you're saying is also like through our election programs, we also heard the same thing, that people were not getting their sample ballots on time. They were getting the vote by mail ballot first and the sample ballots after. And I think that was causing some confusion of what was the mail ballot, what was the sample ballot as well too. So I think this was like a very clear bipartisan cleanup bill that everybody was on board for. And so a very like quick and easy fix that's really going to help voters and make the process easier, which is like what we care about. And I'm really excited that it was a bipartisan effort. I think this is just shows like we still can have bipartisan legislation be passed and be signed by the governor. I think it's exciting that this is a great access point for voters in the upcoming elections.
Do you know the buffer like timeline? Is it, a week before the real ballot or 10 days before, or what's the time frame?
I think they'll start implementing it. I think it's going to be January 1st, 2026 usually. I think that's the implementation date. So once they work out the statute language, I can get back to you, but I need to see like what the time frame would be. I'm hoping it'll be a week or two before the mail ballots go out, but I can definitely get back to you on that one.
Another one I wanted to highlight was Assembly Bill 73, which is now going to require any election-related materials that have been created or manipulated using artificial intelligence, AI. It doesn't outlaw those materials with AI, but it makes it so that has to be disclosed on the postcard or the email or the commercial or what have you, right? How does that bill work exactly? And what kind of prompted that? Has this started to crop up as an issue already?
Yeah, I mean, like I think just like you said, like if you are working on a campaign and you are putting out any sort of mailer or digital or billboard, and it is we're calling it digitally manipulated or using AI, basically, you have to put a disclosure on that mailer, billboard, or digital ad, or even commercial if you end up using that. And I think that's really important so that the voters and viewers of that ad know that it has been altered or they're using AI. And then I think another really important part of this bill is if the candidate doesn't put a disclosure on there, the other candidate can file against them in district court. So there is some like accountability here that to make sure that they are using these disclosures. And I think just with, AI is this like new technology that we're seeing everywhere now. And so I think that this is a really important regulation in the election and campaign world to make sure that we're using it in the correct ways and making sure that voters know, what is AI and what is not AI. I think that's super important moving forward.
Is that something that we were prior to this bill having passed in the 2024 elections, was
Mhm.
that starting to become an issue? Were there materials sent out where it was a little bit fuzzy as to whether AI was being used? Was that causing confusion, or is it just kind of getting out in front of a potential issue down the line?
I think in 2024 there was a lot of like deep fake videos and pictures on mostly on the internet, and so I think that this is trying to make sure this doesn't happen in other forms of media. So I think this was really smart. To we already saw it coming, and so this is just to protect future issues that we could see down the road. So I think this was a really great way to get ahead of this.
Another one that was interesting to me was Assembly Bill 123, prohibiting threatening or intimidating candidates for public office or their family members. There was legislation 2 years ago, I believe it was, that prohibited threatening or intimidating election workers. And it seems
Yeah.
like this bill is kind of expanding on that to include candidates for public office or their family members. Why is that bill necessary?
So I think this bill is necessary because the sponsor, we heard her story about how she was threatened in her election, actually by her, unfortunately, by her opponent. And so I think another reason, while even though this is just one story, through that bill hearing, that process, I heard several stories, like anonymous and not anonymous, that this had happened to other people, not just from their opponents, but from people with while they were running their campaigns or even while they were in office. So just making sure that we are doing something to protect people that want to run for office or are in office, because I think once again, it's like getting ahead of this issue that could become a bigger problem as we go into 2026 and 2028 elections. So I'm happy that this was passed through the legislature and signed by the governor. I think it's really, really important to make sure that we're protecting anybody that wants to serve, but also making sure that we're holding them accountable as well too.
Can you remind me? I don't forget which lawmaker that was and the specifics of that story, if you recall.
There were just some problematic things put on her her opponent's mailer about her, like maybe on the line of threatening. And then it was Assemblymember Nadeem, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure it was Assemblymember Nadeem that was the sponsor of it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. And we did a two-part series last year on probably something similar here in Northern Nevada, where a couple local candidates were
Mhm.
depicted in some nasty ways and some language that definitely was verging on threatening or intimidation. That is kind of a fine line, though. My question for you would be like, obviously, it is part of our public democratic
Yeah.
process for you to be able to fairly criticize your opponent but
Mhm.
like, where do you draw the line? When does that become intimidation, threatening, and how's that not going to infringe on a candidate's First Amendment right or anyone's First Amendment right to criticize politicians?
Definitely, yeah. I think criticism of their actions or like bills they're passing or bills they're voting for or things they're doing. But I think what we're talking about here is, and I know the mailers that you're talking about is when we're talking about somebody's like race or sexual orientation or gender. I think we're going over to the line in hate speech. So I think it's completely and totally okay to criticize somebody on a vote they took or a position they took or anything like that. But I think where we need to be a little bit careful is like when we're crossing the line into death threats or threatening their safety or hate speech. So I think that's what this bill does is draw that line very, very carefully.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
You guys track, probably dozens of voting related bills that were introduced. Some of them get hearings, some of them don't, some of them pass and didn't. What are some other ones we haven't mentioned that stand out to you guys as kind of as you guys would see it, probably big wins for Nevada tinkering with our
Yeah.
voting laws.
So two of the bills that my organization led to our biggest wins were SB 421. And so basically this is another very simple cleanup bill. So in my organization, we work a lot with tribal nations and tribal leaders. And what we found is that there was sort of a miscommunication between the county clerks and the tribes when they were recruiting poll workers. And so what we did to fix this is basically require clerks to recruit the poll workers if that tribal nation basically asks for help or assistance with recruitment, and then also offer some accessible training options. And this can be virtual or actually on the reservation itself, because what we saw is that some of the tribes are 1, 2, 3, 4 hours from their county clerk's office. So it was very hard for them to get to that location. And so this will create a better pathway. And also, here in our state, we haven't had a huge culture of voting in our tribal reservations. In 2020, we only had, I would say, 7 tribal adjacent polling places. And now we have over 20 polling places actually on tribal reservations. And so I think that this could just really continue to help with that culture of voting and that accessibility that we want to make sure that tribal nations have, just like everybody else in our state. So that was a really big win there. And another great bipartisan effort. I don't think we had a single person vote against this bill. So that was really exciting. And then the other bill that we worked on was AB 367. And what this bill is going to do is currently the Secretary of State's office, they have a language access hotline of over 200 languages and ASL. And this is just going to codify that hotline into law. And so that way, any Secretary of State, no matter who it is, will have to keep this hotline up. And really what this is for is because in our 15 rural counties, there's currently no language access materials because there's no mandate right now for that. And so really just offering those communities a lifeline, which I think is really important. And then they're going to translate the 7 most common languages into voting materials on their website. And so that will be codified into law as well too. This will fund a language access coordinator position. And then the Secretary of State's office will also have to communicate in English and Spanish, which I think with Spanish being the second most spoken language in our state is really important as well too. And then the last thing that is doing this will have a direct effect on the counties is my organization, we also work very closely with the deaf and hard of hearing community and the voters with disabilities community. And one thing that they told us is it would be really helpful if they could have a device at polling places because it helps them be ordered to vote. And so if you have any sort of disability and having that device on you makes it easier to vote, you'll be able to use your device now at polling places. So I think that's a really significant and another way we're just making Nevada voting more accessible.
Very good. Yeah. And I think all of these bills that we've mentioned today had some kind of bipartisan support.
Yeah.
And
that one did as well. That one did as well. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. And I should clarify for our listeners, I've been using the term bill. Really, we should be saying law now because these have all been signed into law, all these measures that we're now discussing since the time period for the legislature has passed. One that did not become law, though, which I do want to ask you about is voter ID, which I've interviewed you about before.
Yeah.
I know where you stand on the issue, but for our listeners, I'll have you restate your position because there was an effort, surprisingly, by Democratic Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager to kind of get a compromise and establish voter ID in Nevada in order to expand mail ballot drop boxes on the weekend before Election Day. That was a proposal and initiative that he supported. And so at the end, despite being an opponent and a vocal opponent of voter ID for many years, he kind of introduces this compromise to try and get voter ID and expanded mail ballot drop boxes. What was your reaction to seeing that deal come forward? We'll get into why it was vetoed ultimately in a minute. But what was your reaction to seeing that, knowing that, and actually I have a clip here, I'll play it here. This is where Democrats have stood on this particular issue for several years.
Scaling back on the way that we vote, it's a non-starter. So that was, a lot of red meat with the same things we always hear. Fraud, fraud, fraud with no evidence.
And that was Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager in 2023 after Governor Lombardo's State of the State address, where he brought forward a voter ID proposal back then. It was soundly rejected by the Democrats, but a totally different tune at the end of this 25 session. What was your guys' reaction to all this?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify for your audience, like we are all Venice Locals completely nonpartisan, so we're not aligned with either party. We are aligned with policies and making sure we get voting as accessible as possible for voters of this state, basically. So I mean, I would definitely say like we were surprised that this effort came forward, but I think where we are standing is like I'm very aware like where the polls right now are on voter ID. But I think where we're at is like the reality is that we have seen that just fraud is so rare in our state. The Secretary of State's office came out with a report earlier, I think right after the 2024 election, and it showed less than 1% of fraud. So we really feel like we're not really sure what adding voter ID to our election system, what problem it's actually going to solve. And so we really think this is like creating a solution without any problem. And I think the other concern we have is here in Nevada, we have like what's called a cure system with our vote by mail system as well too. And so I think we're extremely worried about the implementation of this with the vote by mail system, and then also the implementation of it for in-person voting and just how it's going to impact voters. And so if this does end up passing in 2026, like we just want to make sure it's implemented in the most like safe and fair way to voters. But obviously, like we are extremely against it. We do not want this to move forward because we do think it's going to have a negative effect on voters in future elections.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, for listeners who might not know, this came after question 6, a voter ID proposal passed overwhelmingly in the 2024 election and needs to pass again in 2026 in order to become part of the Nevada Constitution. Governor Lombardo ended up vetoing this kind of compromise measure, saying that it didn't have enough security standards, but it's going to be on the ballot in 2026, and at least in the 2024 election had a lot of support. So that's kind of the state of play, I guess, when it comes to voter ID. I also wanted to ask you, as we kind of start to wrap up here, there was also from Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager as well, kind of a last-ditch effort to open up our primaries in Nevada to nonpartisan voters. I've talked about this issue a lot on this show. We did the debate on question 3 last year. I think most of our listeners are pretty familiar with it. Did you guys take a position on that effort, which kind of came after question 3 failed in the last election?
On that one, we did not take a position, but I'm happy to explain it to the audience. So basically, if the governor, it did pass the legislature, if the governor would have signed it into law, basically what would happen is you would go to either the Democrat, or you just go to your polling place, and then you could either request a Democrat or Republican or nonpartisan ballot. So it'd really be your choice, and then you would not have to register for that party. So I mean, I did not find it to be a bad compromise in any way. It just wasn't, we just were not able to, I would say, dig deeper into it given like the time frame, unfortunately. But I'm curious like how that proposal, like what we might see in the 2026 election with new ballot measures that might come forth around this. So we'll definitely be looking out for that and seeing like what happens in 2026 around the open primary framework that we saw not only during session, but in 2024 as well too. Yeah.
And I'll just clarify and remind our listeners, Kerry, and all voting is local, were kind of on the no side of question 3 back in 2024, mostly in part because that measure would have also brought ranked choice voting to Nevada, which you guys felt was confusing and just would have made things a little bit more difficult for people. Whereas the open primaries thing, it sounds like you guys would be more open to if that does indeed resurface in the future. What's still left to improve on, would you say? Is it more mail ballot drop boxes, for example? That was something that Yeager did try to get through to where you could drop off your mail ballot on Saturday and Sunday before Election Day, right? I mean, aside from that, what are some other areas where you guys are going to continue to push for more ballot access in the Silver State?
Yeah, I would definitely say his drop off box bill, we were definitely in support of that. So I would love to see that come back in the future, if possible. to get drop-off boxes it would be between the last day of early voting and the Monday before election day, just for voters to have that additional access point. I think that's a great idea for the future. And then for our organization, I think that the one that we were the most bummed about was the automatic recount bill. So that would have, that was the one that we were probably, that was one of our big, I would say, losses. And it was mostly due to the budget deficit. That's why it didn't end up going through, which, that happens. And so I think that's definitely something we could see in the future. But yeah, for your audience, basically what it would have done is if you were under, it was 0.05, you would have gotten an automatic recount for free paid for the county or the state. Instead, right now, what happens if you lose by one vote, you have to pay for that recount. And so I think that just would have made the process a little bit more fair and more accessible because, not every single candidate has the means to pay for those things, especially if you're like a local city candidate. I think that would have made it a little bit more accessible for more people to be able to run and get in the process. So that one is definitely, I think, the one that we'll be keeping our eye on, to bring back, hopefully in 2027. Mm-hmm.
And that was a big issue for a primary here in 2024 in Washoe County, where a city council candidate lost by a handful of votes and ended up getting a lot of criticism for the person that she went to accept money for the recount. I'll put the link to that episode in the show notes to kind of call back to 2024. Kerry Durmick with All Voting is Local. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. Enjoy a little bit of a downtime before we ramp up for midterms next year.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
A special thank you to Kerry Durmick for coming back on the show. If you made it to the end of this episode, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, I want to hear from you. Send me an email at bjmargiott, MARGIOTT, @sbgtv.com and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover Ballot Battleground Nevada. Thanks for listening.